Thank you for joining us also at the 12th edition of Expo Chicago. My name is Taylor Payton, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you today to Dialogues. Dialogues is presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago to offer panel discussions, conversations, and artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, critics, and art professionals on the current issues that engage them. This afternoon, I'm excited to welcome you to the 8th Annual Art Critics Forum, this year presented in partnership with Frieze magazine. The 8th Annual Art Critics Forum focuses on support systems that bolster art writing practices. Panelists working both independently and with dedicated publications are here today to examine the creative and intellectual exchanges that shape their writing, emphasizing the vital role of collaboration in critical production. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's esteemed panelists: Maximilíano Durón, Senior Editor of ARTnews; Jennifer Krasinski, Independent Writer and Cultural Critic; Brandon Sheats, the Executive Director of Burnaway; and Pia Singh, Independent Curator and Writer, as well as our wonderful moderator, Marko Gluhaich, who is the Senior Editor of Frieze magazine. I'll now hand it over to Marko to start us off.
Thank you, Taylor. I'm pleased to be moderating this year's Art Critics Forum and to be speaking with these four great individuals sitting beside me and working within the art critical space. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you to the audience for coming. Today's program will look at the infrastructure around writing criticism today and the importance of it in maintaining the role and well-being of the critic. I hope today's panel will elucidate the greater conversations that go into what you end up reading on the page. Each of the panelists brings a unique breadth of experience across the many aspects of critical writing production. We'll loosely follow three threads based around different relationship types: professional collaboration, mentorship and education, and finally, audience. We'll speak for about 40 minutes and then have time for questions from the audience. I'm going to start with the more general opening questions to which I'd like each of you to respond, and then we could take it from there. Please feel free to chime in, respond to, and ask questions of your fellow panelists. So to open, and I guess we can start with Max and then go down the row. What is the role of collaboration in your critical practice? Or what are the ways you find yourself collaborating with critics, and what is the significance of that collaboration to you? Please provide meaningful examples if they are relevant.
Sure. So I've been at ARTnews for 11 years as of this month. And as a senior editor now, I edit a lot of our freelance coverage that comes in from around the world, ranging from profiles, exhibition previews, and coverage, as well as reviews. I would say I edit the majority of what Alex Greenberger writes, and especially his reviews. If you guys follow our coverage, you will know who I'm referring to. He's my colleague of also about 10 years and a senior editor. And he and I would say collaborate relatively closely in terms of talking on Slack, GChat, text, Instagram, or just turning around. We're in the same row of desks at the office, and two of the only people who come in 4 days a week. And I would say that's a pretty important collaboration. I think we, kind of just vamp and feed off each other, and are able to bounce ideas and make both of our writings stronger and the editing process stronger. And it's been a very meaningful relationship, I would say. And there was a second part of the question.
How you find yourself and what's the significance of that collaboration to you?
So yeah, I would say that would be probably the best one. And then to give an example, after the Venice Biennale, or I guess it published during the preview days, Alex and I published kind of a back and forth conversation that unfolded over a Google Doc in a very conversational tone that I would encourage you to read to kind of get a sense of how our internal dialogue, in a very edited way, unfolds. It's a bit of a insider kind of behind the curtain.
That's a long time. So I'm an independent writer which means I work with several different publications and several different editors. So when I think about the closest possible gesture to collaboration, it's probably with the editors who shepherd my writing, because they're my thought partners and eventually are the closest to the material as it's, forming or coming through. So quick shout outs to a few people who've shepherded me along the way, who are my primary collaborators, starting with Kerry Cardoza, who's at The Reader in Chicago. I have Leanne Norman at the Brooklyn Rail, who's shepherded me for about 2 years while I was working with them. And so many, my gosh, Marko, thank you for, bringing us together for the publication for Expo this year, which has really turned out beautifully. Tempest Hazel, like 60 inches, and 60 inches has a really interesting model where there's this collaborative kind of lateral editorial effort. So it's not like I'm specifically pointing to one, but there are several people on the team who provide feedback and structure and veto the process, so to speak. So these are collaborators I value. But I also take a slightly unconventional route in my writing where I do consider the history of the artist or the exhibition. The artist's lived experience or their history, cultural, political, historical references that they may find pertinent to the material that I'm looking at. So I know that, conventionally there are a lot of critical platforms that dissuade you from speaking to your artist or the curator while writing objective criticism. And I've written for a couple of people like that, and I didn't enjoy the process. But I do see, to some degree, the interview with the artist as a gesture to align, maybe in a collaborative effort towards a parallel history. What was the second part again? Sorry.
The significance of collaborations.
It's everything.
Well, I would echo what my colleagues have already said about editors, so I'll take it in a different direction. It's funny, when Marko sent us the questions, little cheat sheet before we got here, and I thought, collaboration, like the whole reason I'm a writer and a critic is so I don't have to collaborate. I don't want anyone else in my headspace, or rather there is a pleasure of being in one's own thoughts, right, and coming to one's own mind, and solitude and quietude being such a part of writing and thinking. And yet, this is a great question, and it just so happens right now, and it's going to sound like I'm shilling, but I am currently collaborating on a book project with another critic, David O'Neill, who's a critic and writer, and we are now under contract with the University of Chicago. And editor David Olson is somewhere here. Thank you so much. And the book is about the craft of cultural criticism. And so the two of us are now coming together for conversations about what goes in the book. How do we talk about this as a craft? And what's been so edifying is actually, after years of practice and after years of being a working critic, to actually have to sit and reflect and think, okay, how to take all of this knowledge and how to take all of this experience and not only articulate it to a reader, but it's also been, as you say, the sort of, or as you're asking about the meaning, it's been marvelous to reflect on the importance of criticism, because that is what keeps coming up for us. Why do we do it? And why is it feeling more urgent now than ever? It's a question that probably answers itself. And so it has been actually incredibly invigorating and very grounding at this time to have this project and to be in dialogue with another critic, which again, I'd never really done before, so.
In my role, I'm the publisher side. So I'm the one that's supposed to interact with everybody so that writers never have to interact. And for us at Burnaway, since we're covering a whole region of the country and being very intentional about that, we end up collaboration ends up being the essential piece of our entire operation. So because we're based out of Atlanta, Georgia, but we're working with people in New Orleans and Miami and Knoxville, et cetera. So we're we're working with regional partners, museums and institutions, and so on. We're working with writers in different communities who, if it weren't for a Burnaway or another large publication, they would have no bylines. And we also have like a really, internally, we have a really brilliant team with at the org. Her name's Courtney McClellan. She's our editor-in-chief. She actively also sits down with me a lot of the time, and while I'm sitting down and thinking about money and audience and how we're going to redo our website, I'm giving her the freedom to go out into the entire region, into the country, and seeing not only the South, but the Southern diaspora, and interact with artists, interact with writers, and putting them together. And while she's doing that out there, I can focus on my job, and we can ultimately be in service to the artist. I mean, that's the thing that we always come back to. Our primary collaborator is always the artist themselves, because without that, we don't have a foundation to work on. We have nothing to cover. Why are we here? So collaboration is the core.
Thank you all. I want to actually follow up, Brandon, on what you were speaking about and ask, talk a little bit more about Burnaway and its unique place as being a regionally focused publication looking at arts across the American South. But I want to ask, how do you all foster this community of critics across the region, and what sort of initiatives are you thinking about in terms of building up that community?
Let me start from here. The thing about the American South that I think a lot of the country doesn't understand, but is really understood on a more global level when you think about the American South, is that the American South contains all of America's joys, but also a reflection of every American ill or crisis. And through that space, we're able to. What was the back half of that question again?
How do you foster community critics and build them up?
And so through that back half, that's the space that we're able to really build up a community. For a long time, the running narrative, as we were switching from being a Atlanta-only art blog that was present during the Great Recession when art coverage was cut, to now a Southern and international publication, really, because we added the Caribbean last year. Being able to go into those communities and physically make ourselves present and known. For example, 2 weeks ago, I showed up in Memphis for a gallery opening, and immediately people went, "Oh, no one really comes here." That's a really essential part of what we do. A few years ago, we had an art writing mentorship program that began in the mid-2010s. And in 2020, with the pandemic, we transitioned it to all virtual. And we were discovering people from everywhere that really wanted to be a part of the program. And we're going, look, it's only 4 weeks. We're just doing this as an experiment. And we decided to make that permanent because we're reaching writers where they are and encouraging to write from where they are. And when we go and visit them, we don't just show up and say, "Hey, we're here. You have to love Burnaway." We say, "Hey, let's do a happy hour." Oh, drinking's not a big part of the culture. Let's do some kind of gathering, some kind of convening, some kind of something, so that not only is it just writers behind screens or behind paper, it's writers interacting with each other and in the public and participating in that public. And that's really the core of that community building that we do.
And I'll just add, I think publications like Burnaway are so important to the ecosystem, really focusing on parts of the world that are not really covered as well by national and international publications that are based in New York or London or Paris or Hong Kong. Like having a venue for writers to write for an exhibition, about an exhibition or an artist who might not get picked up by a New York art publication, I think is really essential, and it helps, just create a more fertile gathering of writing and, support for artists and curators. Yeah.
Well, and to that, we don't. It is not our job to compete with, with the national and international publications. For us, we view, and I'm really glad to be here and be invited, because for us, it's about infrastructure. We, every few years, there's always something that says art writing's in crisis. Art, this magazine is going, that magazine is going, this magazine is sunsetting. And for me, I kept thinking, part of what we can do is provide infrastructure for writers to advance themselves, and also for artists to understand that there's not only a social ecosystem to their practice, but there's also an economic ecosystem that they can participate in. So, for example, another one of our partnerships is we take a emerging Southern artist to an art fair. And we do that so that the global market can see what they're capable of. Writers from outside of that market, outside of the region, can see them. And that artist goes back and says, oh, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So we're just figuring out different ways to feed into the broader ecosystem.
It's amazing. I'm thinking about this idea too of these ways of bringing people together. Max, in addition to the work that you do at ARTnews, you co-founded the initiative Critical Minded. Could you describe that project?
Yeah, so Critical Minded was, the brainchild of two foundations, their program officers who had been previously cultural writers and critics of color and kind of came together to convene a gathering. I forget what year. It was a few years ago, maybe 2018. And so it was kind of like I was part of this co-founding cohort. I think there were 50 people in the room. We were at the Ford Foundation's offices. And it was, just a really interesting convening where you really got to hear. I was much earlier in my career at that point, kind of people who had, written for the Village Voice in the 80s and, talk about their experience trying to, write about, hip hop and rap from their perspective. And, I can't remember exactly what she said, but Dream Hampton was on one of the panels, and it was, just really important to kind of hear kind of how she carved out a path for herself, within this field. The organization is now kind of formalized as its own nonprofit with an executive director. And I would say they haven't moved away from supporting, visual arts coverage, but, organizations, are usually as good as the people that are there. So with the executive director having more of a film background and, film and music having larger critical communities, visual arts criticism being a little more siloed, we're not necessarily kind of always at the forefront, which is fine. But I will shout out the Rabkin Foundation, which gives out, grants to visual arts journalists and critics every year. I was part of the 2023 cycle. 8 people won that year. And that was a really important thing. As soon as it launched, I was like, I hope one day I'll have the honor to be considered for this. It was a dream come true. It's helped me a lot financially. And they have a new executive director who has been really trying to create a community in New York and LA and other cities to bring people who are in town and kind of connect us with each other, because I don't think most of us know each other. I know maybe 2 or 3 awardees in the entire, they're on the this year might be the 10th cycle that they've been giving it out. So
Thank you. I want to ask to everyone, but maybe Pia and Jennifer, you can start. How involved are others in the creation of a work of criticism? And I wonder if in the process of putting this book together, you've seen different ways of this manifesting itself throughout the history of the craft. And also, what does that ecosystem look like to you?
Okay, all right, I will start. Okay. If I understand the question correctly, how many people are involved in the creation of a work of criticism? I think on the daily basis, or on the sort of the deadline to deadline basis, it really is writer in collaboration with editor. And yet I do receive a lot of support from museum staff or gallery staff in terms of supplying all the relevant information, allowing me to linger in the gallery a little bit longer than everybody else. And yet I think the process really does feel like it's very much in dialogue with my editor. Whoever that editor is, it changes depending on assignment to assignment. In the matter of the book, or are you just thinking historically, have there been other sort of collaborative opportunities around criticism or?
Yeah, if there have been other opportunities sort of thing, or just different platforms for editing, as Pia was alluding to.
Yeah.
Multiple editors working on a piece, or the sort of dialogues that can bring about.
Yeah. I mean, I've always had one editor apparently, and then there's always a top editor and so forth. So the funny thing is a lot of the collaborative labor, of course, of editing is pretty invisible, even to the writer sometimes, who's going through it, copy editors and so forth, fact checkers, of course, God bless fact checkers, really bring them back.
the studio managers who help facilitate the fact checking with artists who have a fun relationship
God bless
with facts.
the studio managers. Yeah, no. But it's interesting. I'm thinking about this question of the collaboration and writing and critical thinking. And I do think that conversations that I have that I don't necessarily end up kind of giving due respect to, after a show, or I'm sure you've all had that. You go and see something, you end up having these casual conversations with peers, with artists, with whomever, and it sticks with you. And as someone who is very aware that I really can't sort of express other people's opinions in my own writing, that would lack ethic and integrity. Just that energy that a show can produce, that an artist can produce, that a work of art can produce, that a community can produce. I don't know, it's hard to articulate, but it does sustain, and it does sort of, I would say, personally keeps me going back to want to keep writing. It isn't necessarily just about the single show, but it is about this feeling of community, conversations, and that sort of broader landscape. I don't know, Pia, I'm going to hand it to you.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of conversation on ecological thinking, and I'm hearing ecosystem a lot in the last few days, both at this stage, at ICI, at their curatorial sessions, and it got me thinking a lot about your question to us about the ecosystems we function within, and it took me back to complete PTSD of my first year of my master's at SAIC. And I'm supposed to write these papers where I'm supposed to have this first-person opinion as an Indian woman, and I'm like, why? Because I guess the cultural, landscape I come from India, and maybe this is more personal, a filial history a bit, but I was always very uncomfortable speaking in the I. And it got me thinking about the comfort of the frame of we, and I landed up doing a little bit of my own research before coming here, and I realized that, forgive me, I'm looking at my notes, but there's a word in Sanskrit which is the word for individualism or individuality, and it's ahinkari, and it actually means the doing of the I, which means that I don't exist or function or cannot serve without the collective I'm situated in. That's really interesting, right? So I think a lot about the forces from the second I've seen something that resonates with me, that have to come into alignment for me to have access to more information for me to then critically engage with it. So starting with, like you're saying, you're looking at this thing in a private preview or extended hours or just on a regular museum day where you're watching other people respond to the work as well. And then the dialogues you have along the way, whether they're intentional or accidental, whether it's with peers or colleagues or the curator or the artist or the press people who invited you to come see the thing. And it's just like a whole cosmology of its own. And then as someone who's trying to frame critical thought, you have to also, at least I have to be very careful about whose thought I'm allowing to like touch or inform or rub off color on me. And usually that's seldom anyone more than the artist. I try very hard to, even if I ask clarifying questions to like a curator, I try not to step into that frame because there's a very specific role in this process. So thinking about ecosystems, right? Like, does that mean that the art world I came from India, isn't part of my current ecosystem here? It can't be, because it informs my frame. Right? So it becomes like, is it a present tense, past tense thing? Can it be a bit of a longer arc, I guess? Yeah.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I want to shift to the next topic that I was considering for this conversation, which is education. And maybe I'll start with a question for Jennifer. You were on the faculty of the MA art writing program at SVA for several years. What was some of the advice that you'd give your students about becoming an art critic?
Terrence, do you want to take that one? Thank you. That is a great question. I am full of advice. Who knows if any of it is useful, but I was thinking about your question out of time, and I think that some of the things I love working with young writers. It's really, aside from writing, it's absolutely my favorite thing to do. And I feel that the landscape right now is so unfriendly. That program, for people who don't know, the SVA program in art criticism was sunsetted a couple of years ago, and it was very heartbreaking for all of us who were in the program and believed in it very deeply, felt it to be a very useful place. Some of the things I do talk to my students about are things like persistence. I know that sounds very general, but it is so easy to get discouraged, and I would just encourage them that no matter if, keep writing. Just sit down and write your thoughts, even if you don't have an outlet, you don't have an editor, you don't have a place to go, it doesn't matter. Keep writing, because a lot of that is about personal relationship to craft and personal relationship to one's vocation. And then just some practical things. I would always talk to them about, like, your editors, whether they are good or bad, and that you'd have to decide for yourselves, but you will learn something from every editor if you allow them to teach you. And really use that collaboration I learned the most from my editors over the years and continue to learn the most from my editors. And something else, and maybe I would love to hear other people's thoughts about this. I think right now, Brandon, you talked about, the magazines sort of disappearing and the publications disappearing and criticism supposedly disappearing. And I keep telling them, the future of criticism is in your hands. And that's not, that should be invigorating to you. That should be exciting to you. And I keep trying to get them to engage in the conversation of where else they would like to see criticism appear. If not in the magazines, what other fora could they provide? Do they want to start new platforms? And it can be a very daunting conversation, but I want to give them that fuel and that understanding that, like, they aren't just at the, beck and call of some big system, that they have absolutely the talent and the energy and the ability to sort of create what they want to create. It can sound a little utopian to some of them. They don't always buy it, but I buy it and I believe it and I've seen it. You think about The Village Voice being started by 3 guys in like an empty apartment. I mean, every great critical journal has a very simple beginning story. So I don't know. How about you all? I would love to.
Well, I'll start. I think just like somewhat of an aside, you've heard today, that criticism's in crisis, and we hear that all the time. And I was, standing over there ahead of the panel, and the attendees from the last panel were kind of, lingering around, and I heard one woman say, "Oh yeah, the next panel's on art criticism. It'll probably be boring," or something to that effect. Not to call her out, I don't know if she's still here, but I heard you. And
No, we're supposed to call them out when they do that, Max. That's our job.
And, I think, some people don't care about criticism. People don't want to pay for criticism. Galleries don't want to support criticism. They'd rather start their own publications that are really just marketing tools. They're not journalism or criticism. And so I probably should be careful how I frame that last part based on where I am today. But I think criticism is important because it's meaningful for artists and for helping them, and for curators as well. I think it kind of helps challenge people to think in new ways. And going back to what Jennifer said, it's kind of like those conversations after seeing an exhibition with someone can be really meaningful they might say something or ask a question about, "Oh, you just said this, what do you mean?" And it can really spark something in how you approach the piece. And I think that's really important. And as someone who, edits a lot of writing, I try to approach it from a place of care. I once, very early when I started editing, kind of was replicating kind of the meanness, the all caps inline editing that had been passed on to me. And someone told me, that was actually kind of hurtful. And, I don't know why you would kind of edit me from that approach. And it's something that I think about every time I open a Word doc and start track changes and how I phrase a comment. I think, the writing is a collaborative place, and it can only really lead from, a place of respect. If there's, or a good place if there's mutual respect, even if the copy is, needs to be, really reworked, there's still a way to kind of help get the best piece out of there.
Do you want me to say?
Oh, no. I think it's from kind of taking from your comments, Max. A lot of people will want to say we're in crisis, art writing is in crisis, art criticism is dead, art criticism is boring, and I think part of it, and I think I can say this because I'm required to have a 10,000-foot view over the entire operation of one publication is, at some point, and I want to say that some point was between 2000 and 2017, there was this kind of disconnect that occurred between a lot of the art industry and the idea of a expanding or a new public. And when that disconnection happened, everything fell from that. And then a lot of scholarship came out in that intervening period about, well, how do we reimagine museums? Okay, great, we've reimagined museums. How do we reimagine art education, period? And then, on a state and local level, government said, we don't really need that much art education. And so publications became one of the first instances that an individual would learn about art at all. And but the way that we've been consuming that information and have been presenting that information kind of assumes that you have a base level knowledge. When you're going through journalism training, like I did growing up, one of the things is don't assume your audience is dumb, but give them enough hints towards something. And with publications, with art media, it started off from assume they know this much, and then we're filling in the gaps. And I think it comes down to, Marko, you were talking about audience early on, on a gallery level and on some other art org levels, there's been that disconnect from the general public still sits. So they don't know how to interpret us. Art fairs are figuring out new ways to reach larger audiences. It's a really big problem, and part of that starts with education. And I think, and part of that education comes from having editors that really care about their audiences, being able to edit and work with writers and take that kind of care and say, you know, we're not, you know, it's not our job to do the takedown or the glowering praise. It's to approach every single person in the process as a person who may or may not know something, or who may have a feeling about it regardless of whatever you do. And I think that level of education is where we're needing to come back into to kind of meet that question and your goals as an educator.
I really appreciate you taking this back to education, because I think I only really started writing because I felt like a lot of the writing I was reading wasn't speaking to someone like me. And then I thought about the inaccessibility of the art world, or how contemporary art seems to be perceived as a silo. A lot of other fields that we are very much engaged with and interrelated with. Somehow, for whatever reasons, probably market and histories and economies that are built off this, but something about critical writing or critical thinking in the contemporary being this, it's historically linked to gatekeeping. It's like you're speaking to the 1%, and I always questioned, I guess, what happens to the fallout of that, right? Like, what happens to the 99%? And if you don't give them benefit of doubt as readers, potentially who you are addressing, that means you're also saying that this is not a place for you to be understood or reflected. So I guess a hope of mine would be is that, you know, we can't build a field without reflecting on our own behavioral patterns. And as collective critics on the stage, a desire I really have is a space for like a polyphony of critical voices, where if we had the ability to sometimes sit down together and actually come at the thing from several different angles, maybe we'd build a more robust critical environment that can then be situated in this contemporary moment, especially, I think, just giving the rising, you know, climate of intolerance everywhere. We can barely tolerate each other. I mean, I know how competitive it is, and it can get really cutthroat, and I just don't see the value of that kind of mentality right now, especially right now, because I think a lot about multilingual publishing and people who are doing work that's, you know, challenging some of like maybe the Eurocentric Western canon terminology, phrasing, and like just dislodging it a bit by bringing in concepts from parallel histories that haven't been accessed or written about. So really coming at it from all angles and sideways would be just more interesting and more robust in terms of building audiences and engaging with them in a meaningful way, I think, yeah.
I had a follow-up question for you, Pia and Jennifer, as someone who was in a master's program and taught at a master's program. How did you approach like art speak and like audience as like a, because I think that is, you know, one of the most alienating things about art criticism is that it's a lot of jargon, it's a lot of art speak. It can be very theory heavy, and it can be really incomprehensible.
That's a really good question. I don't think it ever actually came up directly. But I will say that most of the critics I would put in front of them to read, or most of the literature that I would put in front of them to read, had no art speak whatsoever. And it was really about the craft of writing and expression, and you know, just almost taking it back to basics, description, making something vivid, making something come alive in a reader's mind. And so the art speak, I guess I was sort of dodging it, but also they weren't asking for it either. The program was geared to sort of critical writing and the arts, but it wasn't necessarily going to funnel people directly into arts magazines. But it is an interesting problem that, you know, that language, which is very important to some people in the art world, absolutely alienating to other audiences. So I don't know. Pia, do you have?
So when I was at SAIC, I think the first year, it's also just all very disorienting. You're international, it's a Western, it's a private school, there's a lot of, it's a very specific pedagogy, you're drinking out of a water hose, so it was all very disorienting. So I think I made the big mistake of just emulating some of that, some of those kind of assumptions in regrettably bad term papers, which I would never look at again, just to protect my own ego. And, shudder. But once I started writing more seriously, which was not too long ago, which was really 2017, I started to think about a lot of the writers who were not necessarily arts journalists, but even critical writers, thinkers, people whose style or perspective I admired, and then started, I think so much of the writing is the reading as well, which we all know, but actually learning like the value of a simple sentence and like not necessarily having to go into this convolutedly long compound sentences, thanks to some editors and mentors in the field who pointed those things out, or like John Yao telling me I need to read more Steinberg because I need to just learn how to describe something without saying anything but the description, and really keeping that kind of advice close to every word that is coming after another word. Knowing the value of placing a string of words in a sentence has now become more of my focus than, like I said, those regrettably long, really bad papers. But shout out to Annie Burnoff and Bess Williamson, who are just great professors who actually got me to inculcate a voice at all. Because I think as Indians, often Indian women, neither are you encouraged to speak, leave alone speak your thoughts. And we may be very good at research, but we're terrible at having a firm opinion on anything because it's just culturally not built in. So that's definitely been.
Actually, Max, can I ask you, how do you deal with that as an editor? Because you probably see a lot more of it on your side than, say, in a classroom. I would necessarily say in a classroom.
So yeah, every publication has a very unique, specific voice tone. That's kind of what sets it apart. My role as an editor is to kind of shape pieces that fit into it while still trying to respect a writer's individual voice. It's a really tough thing to balance because, we're the oldest U.S. art magazine. We were founded in 1902. We consider ourselves, a general interest English language publication with a somewhat international presence. We have freelancers we work with around the world, but our offices are in New York. We are very much a U.S. publication, and so because of that, audience is a really tricky thing. Sometimes I don't know who our audience is. Sometimes stories you wouldn't expect to get a lot of traffic do get a lot of traffic. Sometimes stories you really want to get a lot of traffic and think are important don't. So it's still something that's, a guessing game. But I think I agree and disagree with, the simplicity of language. I don't edit in ArtSpeak, but what I don't want to edit in is assuming that our audience is an all-white audience and that certain culturally specific terms need to be explained. I think if those are terms that are common within a community, then they don't really need kind of a positive explanation that a white audience might not understand. I think that's a really important thing. If you don't know that specific term, but someone who, in journalism school, you're taught for a newspaper right at a 5th grade level, if people in a community at a 5th grade level would understand that, then I don't think it needs to be explained. And I think the same thing can go with certain words that are used, as someone who grew up speaking Spanish as Spanglish, I really resist putting, one, those words in italics, and two, putting in parens what they mean. The world has changed. You can Google it. Yeah, and I think that's a hard thing to balance in this kind of globalized world.
But that's encouraging a learning process through your writing, right? That if it's something that catches on to you, then you do the research and it leads you probably to a whole new set of terms and frames. But I do have, this is just to complicate your question. Now we're just ping-ponging. Sorry, Marko.
We're going to have to
We've
move on
taken
to the
over.
audience Q&A
Okay.
in a moment.
I was just saying, just to complicate it, I think a lot about the editor I'm working with as well and their exposure to some of the cultural frames I may be referencing. And sometimes I do tend to write, I'm an immigrant in this country. I was trying to not bring this up. But sometimes I'm forced to write a sentence in a slightly poetic way to have to protect my own interests in the writing. So I say the thing without saying the thing. So if you're looking for it, it's there. But if you're not, you may miss it. So it's there, But I think about sometimes, some of the editors I'm working with, and I do this thing, and they're just like, what? Like, why? And then I have to explain the reason, the impetus, and the poetic maneuver, So sometimes it can get a bit, it can get difficult to advocate for your voice being maintained in those kind of moments. And some editors are just like, you know what you're doing, we trust you, So it comes down to, I think, trust is also, and having a healthy relationship with your editors who you return to again and again. And hopefully we're all teaching each other and it's not just like a one-way street. But yeah.
Thank you all so much. I could really listen to you speak with one another for another 45 minutes. But we're going to move on to audience questions. There's a mic going around. So just raise your hand and we'll...
Hello, my name is Victoria. This question is for anybody to answer. I think there are certain aspects of human nature that may view criticism in a negative way. Can you share an example of when criticism was provided to an artist or to a work of art, a collection, or to a genre that steered it in a way where the outcome was actually positive?
Well, I'll start. I don't know that I'll answer the second part of your question, but it is true that people hear the word criticism and they immediately go to negative response, when in fact, the word criticism is a rave review is still an act of criticism, right? Right. So there's this complication with like what people think and then what actually is. But the second part of your question is so interesting. Can anyone answer that about like a critic actually shaping the outcome of?
There are definitely examples, both in art history and more recently, of a review changing someone's practice, or whether it's positive or negative, often negative. I can't think of any off the top of my head. That's something that's like super worth researching, and I'll probably like fall down a rabbit hole this weekend doing it. But, also, there is pretty much a dearth of negative criticism in the world today. There are very few pieces that are negative. Our approach often is, it's not worth doing a negative review for like an artist that's had one show, because that's, that can hurt their career more than it can help them, especially with the limited resources, staff, and, that we can dedicate to running an article or a review. And then, usually the negative reviews are saved for, the market darlings that like are actually not producing great work, but everyone's buying it, and they have these big museum shows because, the museum trustees collected, and I'm sure that there are some background, suggestions at the very least that happen that get those artists, and with the mega galleries, get them to, well, there's none here, so I can say that. No shade. But, that get those, major surveys and retrospectives that, MoMA, the Guggenheim, the Hammer, et cetera, et cetera.
I just thought of one example, and it's the first to come to mind, but so maybe not the best. But in the live arts, critics have a very, very important place because they also are the sort of documentarians, right? So I'm talking about dance, theater, performance art, and somebody who comes to mind is Jill Johnston, who was the dance critic, very famous dance critic at the Village Voice, who attended a lot of the Judson Church and a moment where artists were coming together with choreographers, filmmakers, and so forth, and creating these sort of happenings and evenings that were done in a night. And so she would attend and write about it the next day for the Village Voice, and she has become, in art history and so forth, one of the only ways we know what happened. And so that's actually, again, not maybe the best example of the one that you were after, but that is an example of how critics can be actually really essential to the health of the community, Yeah.
Get my stuff.
Hello. So one of the things that really brought out to me is when you were talking about like sort of having mutual respect between the artists and sort of the major art institutions, and kind of like what I think it was you, Max, who said like, like the relationship with those institutions and how like over time you don't want the institutions to like make their own publications or to promote and market their stuff. So what my question is how do you balance of like being in service of the artist audience and the art institutions without heavily favoring one over the other?
As someone who commissions stuff, if we've run a profile or an article on, an artist within the past, there's no hard rule, but 3-5 years, it's not, I really won't dedicate another piece to it unless there's a real reason, a real shift in the practice or something, because we don't want to, just be favoring artists we love. That's all I'll say on my part.
Can you repeat, like, you're talking about, let me repeat this back to you. You're wondering about how do we as practitioners within publications balance all of the different parties outside?
Yes, exactly. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, yes, exactly.
So the simplest answer is we don't. And that is because, no, I'm going somewhere with this. But the simplest answer is that we don't. Again, sometimes I wish Courtney were here because she would come in and say the simpler thing. But it is our job, well, at least my job, is primarily the audience. I am talking to no one else but the person that wants to pick up the thing, go to the website, pick up a print edition, and do that part. And as well as, like with Max, we don't keep a very hard rule, but we are very intentional and careful about the people the institutional types that we work with and how we work with them. Like even down to, from the gallery to even some of our funders. We are very intentional about working with people that share a common goal, not just their goal, that they project as common interest. So I hope that helps you.
Yes.
Thanks for the discussion. I want to ask a question about language very broadly, and both Maximilíano and Pia touched on this a bit. This is a U.S. English forum that we're sitting within, but we're living in a very multilingual and multivocal world and country and place. And this is a question that I'm bringing from the borderlands, from Texas, from the Deep South, from multiple Americas, from rural Americas. I'm curious about creative ways you're thinking about or seeing or attempting to bring in a multivocality, multilingual perhaps, but also I'm thinking about regional English from the Deep South and how you're seeing criticism respond to that, be open to that, or be not at all open to that in where you're working.
By multilingual, you mean like articles in multiple languages running?
I didn't say that. I'm interested in Spanglish. I'm interested in multiple languages, but I'm also interested in multiple Englishes. Yeah.
I really wish we could do more of kind of those kinds of experiments. I think there are writers who know how to deal with that and very seamlessly and very intellectually in a way that's really great. There are people who I read over and over again who do that specifically with Spanglish. But, you know, as a legacy publication, I would say, you know, we're not as open to it. Perhaps that can change. But to go back to the question I thought you asked, we wouldn't have the resources to, like, as a very small publication with a small team, we wouldn't have the resources to translate anything that's not Google Translate. You know, like whatever that websites have and can toggle.
Only because we're in Chicago and we're here, and I mentioned it before, but like a good example is 60 Inches that does prioritize pieces that are written in like bilingual pieces, but are also transcribed by a person who is close to the source text, right? So there's some kind of beauty to that kind of translation versus, say, a transcription software, Google, whatever, all of those are. Personally, I have struggled with this in a significant, like out of 5-6 years I've been writing, the first 2-3 were really silly arguments, like me saying I'm from India and we speak broken English and I speak the Queen's tongue. I sound this way despite living here for 12 years. You know, I haven't taken on an accent intentionally. And I try to trick my editors sometimes into like seeing the reason why I need that sentence to be slightly jarring or broken English, because I'm also coming at it as an Indian woman living here in a specific time, cultural frame. It's a political thing. Often it's shot down, it's cleaned up, it's reframed. But then when I tend to use certain phraseology that may be from, say, India or South Asia or something, or even certain like small rural dialects in parts of America, like I'm learning in the process of writing this piece too, right? If there's very good reason for that term to be there and I justify it in the longer framing of the piece, it usually gets through. So I'm trying to stick with that in everything I write, and in that sense align myself with the artist's practice if it has that need or that kind of historic necessity to go there. So there's cases for both, but I do think it's important to have a polyphony of this. It's a social polyphony we're creating through writing, right? So that'll only create a more tolerant atmosphere, at least in the field, pushing out, even if the rest of the world is going in the opposite direction. At least so I believe or choose to hope.
I think we have time for one more question.
I was curious of kind of your thoughts on your favorite piece that you've written and why it made you so excited to begin to like start writing. It doesn't have to be your first piece, could be a recent piece, but you know, what re-sparked kind of your energy to get excited about criticism?
I'll start. I'll give 2 examples. The first one is, I mean, we have 1 print issue a year now for ARTnews, but it was my first cover story. It was for what was called the underrated issue, and it was looking at artists who hadn't gotten their due. And on the cover was Judith F. Baca, who's a very important LA Chicana artist who had actually never received a profile from an art magazine, even though she's been working since the late 60s, maybe early 70s. And I think that's like really important that I could help affect that change, help spotlight my community. And then the second one is something that I still do annually this year, as part of our year in review coverage, is kind of like the year in Latinx art. I was kind of just moved one year to write about it because there was such a kind of groundswell of stuff happening in the mainstream U.S. art world supporting Latinx art, and it's something I continue this day. And it's, I'm a little more organized now about kind of taking notes on exhibitions I want to write about throughout the year, as opposed to just the last month of the year.
I find it very hard to read my writing. I'm not gonna lie. It's just like this. It's a very difficult process. It's like a tough look in a mirror. It's all too real. And then there are parts of you that have grown from the process of writing, and you see it in retrospect, and you're like, oh gosh. But recently, I wrote a piece on Ming Smith. She had a Columbus-wide retrospective across 3 institutions, and I was invited there to see 2 of the 3. And I tried to take an experimental approach with Brooklyn Rail. It didn't land well. And they were like, maybe not. And I was like, okay, fine. And gave them a pretty straightforward piece, which I'm still very happy with. But I think Ming and I both in the conversation took away a lot, and I learned a lot in the process. So I'm grateful for those kind of opportunities.
Your question is so beautiful. I want to thank you for it. And I wish I had a better answer, but the first thing to come to mind is that I wrote last year a piece on a poet, actually, Anne Carson, for Book Forum. And I was completely unemployed at the time, terrified about money, had this one commission, and I could spend fully 2 weeks reading her, thinking about her, and writing. And in that process of being terrified, but also completely obsessed with getting this right, what I realized is how much of criticism for me, especially in those moments, is about saying thank you to someone who has meant a lot to me, artist, writer. And in this case, I felt I had actually kind of risen to the occasion of saying thank you properly to a writer whose work has just sort of been in my brain for a really long time. And it was a very lovely feeling. So, Brandon?
I'm going to use this to platform a couple of pieces. One of the pieces is part of the reason why I knew that I was going to be at Burnaway for a long time. It's by a writer, her name's Bryn Evans. It's titled Black Appalachia. She connected Moses Sumney to bell hooks into Black Appalachia in less than 2,000 words. And that piece, when it came out, it was the most read piece that entire year for us. Because it was so direct and touching about the poetics of Moses Sumney, along with the rural nature and background of bell hooks, and figuring out how do you like connect to those two with what most people think of as like this very white experience, Appalachia. That's one person that I think in one piece that really moved me, and in fact, that piece was the one that won her the Rabkin and made her the youngest person to ever receive that award. And then there are 2 writers out of Florida, Frances Dunbar and Isa Marie Garcia, that when Ron DeSantis last year cut art completely from the state budget of Florida, and Florida spends, I think it's like the most per capita, one of the most per capita in the country at the time for the arts. It's like $8 or $9 of your tax money goes back into it in the state. They came to us with a proposal to do a package on not just the political aspect of it, but how this directly affects not the artists or the organizations, but rather the communities around it. And that was a really interesting and community-driven effort that decentered the arts and centered the effect of it, which I thought was really intelligent and clever.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you all for a wonderful panel. Enjoy the rest of your days.